To inhabit the mystery of life involves, to me, trying to make sense of it in a way in which we can probably trust or we can learn from different cultures, different traditions, but in a way in which we have to differentiate between what people have taught in different periods of history and the way in which they had to make sense of their own existence at the time, on the one hand, and also trying to understand what they were aware of, what kind of wisdom or access to reality, if we may speak in that way, they had, so that they were able to integrate that knowledge with their own need or necessity to make sense of their own time, of their zeitgeist. And I mentioned that because in Veils of Unity, the invitation is exactly to follow the path of life in a way in which we try to grasp as much knowledge as we're able to in order to live a better life, but without pretending to know. It's very important to accept that life is probably in the end something mysterious. We really don't know. I prefer that stance in which we accept the fact that we are trying to understand, that we are trying to know, but we really don't know. But there are so many proposals in history, proposals related to different religions, different spiritual traditions, which are aimed at giving us some sort of a map through which we may follow life, we may walk through life. And whenever we see the different conceptualizations of God, for instance, understood in an anthropomorphic manner or in a much more abstract manner as some non-duality, which we cannot really understand, grasp, or name, independent of the way in which we try to make sense of existence through transcendence or through immanence, at the end of the day, we really don't know. And I don't pretend that to be a truth. I'm just trying to state the point of view from which here in Veils of Unity, we are dealing and trying to understand the different spiritual traditions. As far as I have understood, in life, we have different sources in this effort trying to make sense of it. One of these sources is all the information that we may receive out of the so-called sacred texts. Maybe here it's important to mention that a sacred text is considered sacred, not necessarily because of the content, but because of the source. But we will talk about this in later podcasts. And so one of the sources which we may use in order to make sense of life are the texts that have been written in different traditions, which aim at explaining to us what the cosmos is, why it is, and what's the purpose of all of this. And there we may find great sages and wisdom in the Sufi tradition, in the Gnostic tradition, in the Kabbalah, in the Shaiva, the Vishnu, the Japanese Buddhism, in both its Zoto and Rinzai forms, also the Shinto tradition. And so it's very interesting because there's a very beautiful cat here, and he has been following me for a while already. So it's very important, I think, to understand that this kind of source of knowledge is something that we may study, trying to make sense of it through a hermeneutical effort. That is to say, we must try to interpret it in a way in which we should consider the context in which it was written or revealed, and the way in which we may grasp its inner meaning in order to make it useful for our daily lives today. So this is one of the sources, the sacred text. And it involves both reason and the heart to interpret its inner meaning. As far as the knowledge contained within this text is always something that cannot be grasped only rationally. Many times you might have experienced that there is something inside, metaphorically, symbolically represented, that we can only grasp all of a sudden, as if suddenly we were able to get what the real meaning of that is inside. But when we say a real meaning, I don't mean the last meaning. Probably in all this wisdom or in all this wise text, what we find is several different layers of meaning, which we may understand all of a sudden out of our own spiritual evolution, out of the concrete moment or a period of life in which we are. And so the sacred text can be grasped both making use of tools like our brain, our reason, but also our intellect understood as this capacity to grasp immediately the meaning. So one of the sources is this sacred text and the specific kind of interpretation that we do of them out of our own experience, our own knowledge, and trying to make sense of the period in which they were written. Another source that we may try to use in order to make sense of life, accepting the mystery of it, is what our heart tells us. By that I mean that sometimes, I don't know if you've had this experience in which it is as if something inside, which is not exactly our mind, is telling us in a very subtle and in a very low volume voice what something is about, what the core aspect of some situation or about a question that we have, and we suddenly listen to that statement or answer, or sometimes it is even a question that is impelling us to search for more knowledge. So I would say that our heart, understood as this something that from within is telling us or is guiding us, is another source, if it's not the main source, that we should follow in our lives. Having said that, it's very important to consider that for many of us, very common people, just fellow travelers in this path of life, we tend to be confused and we tend to be trapped by our own minds, our own egos, and we do exactly the opposite of what we are aiming at or of what we value in life. So trying to listen to our hearts is something that requires discipline, honesty, and a real intention, and I would say a real aspiration towards truth. In my experience and in the experience of so many people I've met all along my life, we might have this aspiration, but there are so many things, so many situations in life that we have dealt with in a very negative manner, or in a manner that goes exactly in the opposite direction of what our heart is saying, that sometimes we may doubt whether we are really honest or not in our search. I would say that probably we are, and it's very important to become aware of the fact that for some reasons that we may or may not understand, and being responsible for them, sometimes we are led astray. But we may always come back, as the great sage Rumi says, that we are always coming back to our path. And that's the real way of being in a path towards truth, like an effort of coming back all the time. And that involves listening to our heart. So I would say that is a second source in order to make sense of life, inhabiting it as what it appears to be, a mystery. We have already spoken about sacred texts and about listening to our hearts as two sources that might help us in this effort to trying to make sense of life and inhabit its mystery. There is a third source that we could consider, which is commandments or discipline. This might be kind of shocking to some people to accept that there are some things that normally religion indicates to us that we should follow in order to be within the field of the inner quest for truth. By that, I mean that there are so many structures that we should try to establish in our own lives, something like a discipline in order to create a rhythm that at its time also creates the inner space in which we may consider or we may get in touch with our inner heart. It might sound a little bit cryptic, maybe it's just my difficulty to explain, to depict this, but in essence, it involves having a very well-defined space within which we may initiate the inner path towards our heart, towards truth, towards this inner realm in which we feel ourselves connected to life or to God. And these commandments, this discipline that might be that might have a very religious content, or it might be more connected to self-discipline, like in the meditation traditions, like in the yoga tradition, for instance, whether there are commandments as how to behave, or there are certain practices aimed at calming down our mind, at focusing our attention, or whether there are some commandments or instructions about how to behave before all the symbols of the divine, like the different gods and the offers that we offer to these gods, the way in which we experience and enact our own devotion, which is a third way in which all these religious practices intend to teach us how to do it. All these commandments are like a scaffolding, as a structure that might help us not to go astray and lose our main purpose. For instance, it's very interesting that in Al-Fatiha, the first Quranic surah, it is said that the person, the believer, asks God to lead him to the straight path. Ihdina sirat al-mustaqim is the expression that they use, in which they're asking to be guided to the right path. But then they add that they need to be guided to the right path, not to the wrong one, but even more importantly, not to go astray. And to go astray meaning to just get lost in the multiplicity of life, of the world. So this discipline, these commandments, these rules are aimed at delineating a field within which we should try to stay if we are aiming at achieving something internal, whether it is conceived as a connection with God or as realizing non-duality. There is another source that we may use, that we have at hand, in order to trying to understand how to walk through the path of life, which is the relationship that some people may have with the master, with the sheikh, with the guru. And I say I would like to be very cautious about this, because I have had so many experiences in which I have met really wise people in life who sometimes pretend to be a master, a sheikh, or someone who is much more ahead in the path of life. And that might be true in many cases, but it's also a very delicate aspect to have this kind of relationship, because I have also seen that sometimes we as disciples, as students, might forget that we have our own capacity to discern and our own heart, which is where God inhabits and tells us and guides us. Because at last, at the last moment of the day, the real guru is God, and he, she, it, or however we would like to conceptualize God, is inside. So it's true that we need wise people around us who can behave as a mirror to show the defects and the delusion that our own egos create. That is completely right, I would say. But we need to be very cautious, very careful about having this kind of relationship with someone who calls himself or herself as a master. And there is one very good recommendation, which is to check whether this person is really aiming at our own heart or is aiming at him or herself in order to be followed. I know that there are so many great masters that have achieved great state of consciousness or have really abandoned to a great extent their own egos through devotion, through becoming instruments of God. But we have to be very careful because each one of us has the capacity to find someone according to our own state of consciousness. And I would suggest that no guru, no master, no sheikh will really lead us towards truth, but our own heart, which is God within us. And by that, I mean that no one should be abandoned in a way in which I don't trust my own intellect, I don't trust my own heart or my own capacity to discern. But I should listen to, I should learn from every wise guru, sage, but I think it's very delicate to abandon oneself in the hands of another person. I know that in every tradition, this abandonment is a requirement. It's a requirement for truth. But I don't know, I have my doubts whether one should really do that, just meeting someone who seems to be wise or sage. That's why in Veils of Unity, I invite you as fellow travelers, just as people who would like to share a good cup of coffee or a glass of wine, talking about life without pretending to know what this is about. In no way. What we are really trying to do is to create a community where we can have this kind of conversations, trying to be as precise and honest as possible, sharing our own experiences. That's why I invite you to subscribe to our channel so that there can be more and more people willing to talk about what all is about, but without pretending to really know. That's just sharing our own experiences and knowledge. So I would suggest that in order to make sense of life in this context that we cannot or we do not really understand what the mystery of life really involves, and as we are trying to understand the real meaning or the great teachings of all the texts that we have been talking about, texts coming from the Arabic, the Abrahamic, the Hindu, the Japanese, the Chinese, or the American traditions. When we are trying to do that, we should try to integrate probably what our heart, our mind, and our guts are telling us. Sometimes we should listen to our own emotional reactions. Sometimes we should follow our reason, but probably most of the time we should be able to integrate all that in our heart, that aspect within us which seems to be the divine within ourselves, the divine in terms of the place where God, where consciousness is expressing, manifesting itself in order to guide us in life. So I suggest that whenever we are trying to make sense of the mystery of life, let's try to listen to our emotions, our brain, our reason, but always integrating it with the truth that seems to come spontaneously from our hearts.